Hi, from home. Um, I'm going to show you a project, sculptural project, um, working off of a shell. If you have a seashell at home, um, this is a really interesting thing to do. Um, if you don't have a seashell, can't find anything resembling a seashell, you can use a piece of fruit, a vegetable, could be a banana, could be unusual kind of fruit like a star fruit or anything that has an interesting form. And we are going to make it into a box. We're going to make it sculptural, and it's going to be uh, small because I know you don't have a whole lot of clay at home. And it's going to be a really interesting piece. So what I'd like you to do is wedge up some clay. So especially working at home, we've got to really be sure that we're not letting our clay dry out because it's a lot more trouble to try to reconstitute it at home, but you can. So if your clay gets dry, you can wet it back down and recycle it, but it's going to be a lot more work than it is at school to do it. So preferably keep your clay moist. And if you have questions, of course, ask me, save them for the end of the video. But let me know what your questions are. So I'm going to adjust this camera now so that you can see my hands. So I'm going to start by wedging, and fortunately I have this nice granite countertop, but you can wedge on any strong surface. You can wedge on a table. It's going to be messy working at home, and I've got white clay here, which is not quite as big a hassle to keep from staining. It doesn't stain things, but using school clay, you're going to want to keep tabs on where it goes because it can stain things. The iron can stain things, but it's a beautiful color, so that's okay. Anyway, what I'm going to be doing with white clay is exactly what you're going to do with any clay body that you've chosen to use. So I want to copy this shell, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, um, just because it's easier to do something bigger, and it might as well be somewhat bigger because it's going to look interesting. But these are not real large projects. However, what you're going to learn from this, you can apply to a large sculpture. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to start with a solid form, and we're going to then hollow it out because we know we can't be more than a half an inch thick. But when you have a complicated form like this, it's really easier to make it solid, and then I'll show you how to carve it out. And of course, I'm doing this video backwards because I already started, and then I realized, well, I didn't show you how I got to this point. So um, this is a part way along the process of making this shell form, and I'm going to show you how we get to the details that we're going to see on the actual shell. But first of all, I want to show you how to get it started because that's often the hardest part. It's like, this is a complicated shape. How do I even get started with it? So what you want to look at is, first of all, if you're making a shell, and you might be making some other object, some other thing. How about a garlic? So I'm going to show you one that I made in the form of garlic. This is, I made this a while back. I love this little box. And again, it was made solid and then hollowed out. So this lid was cut and was all hollowed out. And then I added this flange so that the lid would stay on. So this is a great project for working on at home because it's one of those things that it's slow, but it's very satisfying. So you don't have to have a shell. You can have other kinds of things. But I'm going to show you this shell project. So if you use a head of garlic, I would recommend that you take off all the outer peels, and then you can really see all these beautiful shapes. So I peeled it off to the point of being able to really look at the form. So I'm just going to set that aside for a moment. And now, going back to the beginning of how did I get to this point? So first of all, you're going to be wedging, and be sure you've taken the time to wedge well, because we don't want air bubbles in something, especially something that we worked on a long time, like we are going to work on this a long time. And then I'm going to just slice to approximately the shape, more or less. And I'm going to wrap all of my excess clay so that it doesn't dry out. And I'm just putting it in a plastic bag. Okay, sorry, this is this video is like it's an amateur production. I've never done this before, but hopefully it will be all nice and visible for you. So I'm looking at this shape, and I didn't have this yet, right? I was just starting with this. But I want to kind of expand it, so you have to sort of mentally figure out, okay, what's the big form here? And one thing you can see is that it just does this flaring thing, but it also conforms to an axis. So this central point is in line. It's in line with the bottom. So that's going to help you kind of analyze the shape. And it's kind of a cone shape. It gets wider on one side. So look for the big forms. Don't get distracted by all the details. Those are going to come much later. So we'll start by pressing it into shape. And it's a rough approximation. So like so many of our projects, we could get discouraged in the beginning when it isn't looking the way we want it to look. But you can't let that stop you, because it takes time to develop these ideas. But I'm going to start by establishing that axis. So we have here, this is this point, and then this is this point. So it's already resembling the shape of a shell. And I would encourage you to try to do this without water. At some point, you will want to use water. When I got to this kind of detail, I found that I could moisten it and run my handle on, and that actually really helped to create the spiral. But we don't want to start with water because water is going to just mess things up. It really doesn't help at the early stages. It just makes things too soft and squishy. And the clay needs to have a certain amount of firmness for this. So I'm starting with the cone shape, and then we know we have this spiral up on top. How do you get from that spiral to this swelling shape? Well, you can start by actually spiraling your finger around. Now remember, the spiral just keeps getting wider. So that's already beginning to resemble what the shell does. And you're just going to keep working the clay around, just coaxing it into the shape. Now we know that there's this big opening where the mollusk lived. That was its door, right? So the foot came out, it could eat. I don't know quite how that works, but anyway, someone does. But anyway, the animal could come out because it's basically a snail. It's a type of a snail. And then it could go in and hide, and it had like a cuticle there, so it could slam the door shut. So there's a doorway there. Now, with clay, we don't want to work this thin because that is too easily broken. So what I did was I approximated it. I gave you the idea of it without making it really, really thin. So in order to get there, I should have started filming this when I first started working, but then I realized later you need to see the beginning of the process. So there we go, that's this part. Now what happens here? This is where you're going to be using your powers of observation. It's like, oh, it's not quite what I thought it did. So we know that this is going to open here. So we can start that opening. And there it begins to look like a shell. And then it also has this interesting little thing that happens down here that you can see there. So make that line. And I think it's really good to keep kind of coming back and get your lines to flow, because that's a big part of expression. Art is a combination of simplification and exaggeration when you're trying to depict something real. You are exaggerating what you perceive in it, like what is kind of the main thing that you're noticing about it, and you are simplifying as well. Because if you show every tiny little blurble, it's not as powerful and as expression usually. I mean, you can't totally generalize about art, but it's often the case. So now we're getting to this basic shape, but then I look at it and I go, okay, that's there, but then this part isn't right. So we got to look at it and see, oh, okay, it goes like that. So this is some more like an ice cream cone kind of shape. So that's how you get this form started, is that kind of observation. Keep checking it against what you're trying to depict. See where, it's just like the drawings. You see where what you did is different from the thing you're trying to copy. And, you know, I'm a big believer in copying. I think we learn a lot from it. It's a humbling experience when you realize, you know, how beautiful the thing is that you're trying to copy and how much more there is to it than what you imagined. So that's the pleasure of this assignment, is to see where you can go with the expression of something that you are trying to observe very carefully. So here we go. This is the very rough beginnings. This is about halfway there. So I'm going to be letting this harden up just a little bit before I start to add details. But it's really important that you understand that all of this detail is at the end. It's not what you start with. You want to start with the fundamental shape. So just like with this, the garlic, all these nice little lines that really make it seem like garlic, those were at the very end. That was one of the last things I did. Okay, I'm trying to get this where you can really see it. And there we go. Okay, that little thing at the bottom, which is like really says garlic, that was just suggested, and that got defined at the end. If you do all of the big forms first, you're going to have a much more powerful work of art. Okay, so that's as far as this is going to go. I can't believe how hard it is to figure out where to put things. Okay, that's in front of the camera. Okay, so that is the beginning of the shell project. You're going to be doing all of the sculpting, all the forming before you cut it open. There might be a little bit of detail after you cut it open, but you're going to be working with it solid, and that's the